In 1848, Mexico signed away half its territory. The nation that had stretched from what is now Oregon to Guatemala, commanding one of the largest land masses in North America, was reduced to its current borders in the span of 2 years. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was not a negotiation between equals. It was a sanction, the official recognition of a conquest already consumed by military defeat, political paralysis, and the relentless pressure of a neighboring power that had decided the continent belonged to it. The story of how this happened is not a story of inevitability. It is a story of choices made under pressure, of a nation fractured against itself, and of 2 years in which the geography of the Americas was redrawn by force and necessity. Begin with the end. In February 1848, Nicholas Trist, an American diplomat, sat across from Mexican representatives in a small town just outside Mexico City. The Mexican government was in shambles. The capital had been occupied by American forces for months. The army that had once defended the nation was broken across 100 battlefields. General Winfield Scott's troops controlled the city. Trist presented terms. Mexico would cede more than half of its territory, what would become California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. In exchange, the United States would pay $15 million and assume $3 million in claims by American citizens. Mexico accepted. There was no other option. The alternative was total occupation with no compensation at all. But why was Mexico in this position? Why did a sovereign nation with a government and an army allow itself to be dismantled? The answer lies not in a single decision, but in the inability to make one. It lies in the chaos that gripped Mexican politics from the moment the first shots were fired. Go back to 1846. The United States wanted Texas. Texas had declared independence from Mexico in 1836, and though Mexico had never formally recognized that independence, the territory was slipping away. James K. Polk, the American president, was elected on a platform of continental expansion. Manifest Destiny was not just a slogan in America, it was a governing principle. The nation that occupied the eastern seaboard was meant, many believed, to stretch to the Pacific. This conviction was not whispered in private letters. It was printed in newspapers. It was debated in Congress. It was the animating force behind American foreign policy. Mexico, meanwhile, was struggling to remain a unified state. The nation had endured constant upheaval since independence from Spain in 1821. Governments rose and fell. Constitutions were drafted and abandoned. The army was powerful but divided into competing factions. The landed elite wanted one kind of Mexico. The merchants wanted another. The church held enormous influence. Regional governors often acted as independent powers. This was not simply a young nation finding its footing. This was a nation trapped in permanent instability. When Polk ordered American troops into disputed territory in Texas in 1846, Mexico's government faced a crisis it could not manage. The country was led by President Mariano Paredes, a conservative general. He wanted to resist American incursion, but he lacked the resources and, more critically, the political unity to do so. The moment war became a real possibility, Mexican politics fractured further. Some wanted to fight, others wanted to negotiate. Many believed the real threat was not America, but internal enemies, the liberals, the federalists, the politicians who represented different visions of what Mexico should be. The Mexican Congress declared war in May 1846, but declaring war and waging it are different things. The American army that invaded was superior in discipline, training, and logistics. It was also fighting for a goal that many Americans supported with money and volunteers. The Mexican army, by contrast, was fighting a war that much of Mexico was not convinced needed to be fought. Soldiers deserted. Officers questioned orders. Supply lines collapsed. General Zachary Taylor, leading the American forces, won battle after battle in the northern frontier. at Palo Alto, at Resaca, at Monterrey. Mexican forces were defeated. These were not close fights. They were demonstrations of superior military capacity. Each victory pushed American forces deeper into Mexican territory. Each defeat weakened Mexican political resolve. If the army could not protect the nation, what was the government's legitimacy worth? In Mexico City, Santa Anna returned to power. He had been president 11 times before. He had been exiled. He had been imprisoned. He had lost an arm in battle and was sometimes called the Napoleon of the West. He promised to save Mexico. He promised to drive out the invaders. He promised strength. But Santa Anna was not fighting the same war as his own people. Some factions supported him. Others opposed him. Conservatives feared his ambitions. Liberals questioned his methods. When he tried to raise armies and supplies, he found a nation that was as much his enemy as America was. Meanwhile, the American strategy expanded. Polk ordered a second invasion, this one aimed at California and the Pacific coast. General Stephen Kearny led troops westward. Commodore Robert Stockton brought naval forces to the California coast. The campaign was swift. California, lightly defended and with a population ambivalent about Mexican rule, fell within months. By late 1846, American forces controlled not just Texas, but California as well. Mexico's options were narrowing. The military situation was deteriorating. The political situation was fragmenting. Santa Anna, despite his reputation, could not rally the nation. He was fighting against military defeat, yes, but he was also fighting against a Mexican government, his own government, that was divided on whether to continue the war at all. In the spring of 1847, the Americans launched their main offensive. Winfield Scott, one of the most capable military commanders of the era, landed at Veracruz on the coast and began a methodical march toward Mexico City. He defeated Mexican forces at Cerro Gordo, at Churubusco, at Molino del Rey. Each battle brought the American army closer to the capital. Each battle revealed the same truth. Mexico could not mount an effective defense. The nation simply did not have the coordinated military force to stop a determined invader. Santa Anna made a decision that would define his legacy. He sued for peace. He knew the war was lost. He knew that continued fighting would only mean more death and more destruction. He began negotiations with Nicholas Trist, the American envoy. These negotiations were not between a defeated general and a victorious one, though that was how some saw it. They were between two men trying to manage an impossible situation. But here is where the second layer of Mexico's crisis emerged. Santa Anna could not negotiate alone. He needed support from his government. He needed the approval of Mexican politicians and the endorsement of the Mexican Congress. And that government was fractured. Some factions wanted to fight, to the last man. Others wanted to negotiate, but on better terms. Some questioned Santa Anna's authority to negotiate at all. The political chaos that had weakened Mexico's military effort now poisoned its peace efforts. The Americans, by contrast, had a clear objective and a unified government willing to support it. Polk wanted territory. Scott wanted to occupy Mexico City. Trist wanted to negotiate the terms of Mexican surrender. There was no ambiguity in the American position. By September 1847, American forces had entered Mexico City itself. The capital fell. The national government was in exile or in hiding. Mexico no longer controlled its own territory. The occupation was complete. What followed was the negotiation of terms for the territory that the United States would take. Trist presented his demands. The territories I described earlier. Mexico would lose more than 50% of its national territory. The loss was not theoretical, it was specific. California, with its ports and its geography opening to the Pacific. Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. Chunks of Colorado and Wyoming. These were not marginal lands. These were the vast western expanse that Americans had long believed should be theirs. Could Mexico have rejected these terms? Technically, yes. If the government had refused to sign the treaty, The Americans would have continued to occupy Mexican territory indefinitely. But indefinite occupation meant no compensation, no end to the war, and no hope of recovering any of the lost lands. The choice before Mexico was not between signing and keeping its territory. The choice was between signing and losing everything while the war continued. The Mexican government, fractured though it was, recognized this reality. In January 1848, the Mexican Congress ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo by a narrow margin. The vote was close because many in Mexico saw the treaty as capitulation. But the alternative, rejection, would have meant American occupation with no end date and no compensation. Mexico had lost the military war. The treaty was the consequence. End of Part 1. Mexico had lost half its country. The 2 years from 1846 to 1848 had transformed the political map of North America. The ink on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was still wet when the full weight of what Mexico had surrendered began to settle across the nation. 55% of its territory was gone. California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona and New Mexico, and portions of Colorado and Wyoming now belonged to the United States. In exchange, Mexico received $15 million, a sum that seemed to mock the scale of the loss. But the treaty was not the end of Mexico's crisis. It was the beginning of a new one. Santa Anna, the general who had signed the document, knew what awaited him. The Mexican public had not forgotten his previous humiliations, and now they had a fresh one to add to the list. He had returned to Mexico City as a negotiator, a man trying to salvage what remained of his nation's territorial integrity. Instead, he left as the architect of its amputation. Within months, he would be forced into exile again, his political life effectively over. The Mexican Congress that had narrowly ratified the treaty faced immediate pressure from citizens who questioned whether their representatives had betrayed the nation. Some argued that they should have fought on, accepted occupation, refused to legitimize American conquest. But those arguments ignored a brutal reality. Mexico could not fight on. Its army was shattered. Its treasury was empty. Its government was too divided to mount a coherent defense. The territorial loss was not distributed evenly across Mexico. The northern frontier, the lands directly adjacent to the American border, bore the brunt of cession. These were the territories that American settlers had already begun to infiltrate. These were the lands where the war had actually been fought. In losing them, Mexico lost the buffer zone that had separated its population centers from American expansion. The border that emerged from the treaty was now much closer to Mexico's heartland, to its cities, to its centers of economic and political power. In the United States, the reaction was entirely different. The territories acquired from Mexico suddenly made continental expansion seem not just possible, but inevitable. The California Gold Rush, which began in 1848, the same year the treaty was signed, transformed that acquisition from a political gain into an economic engine. Tens of thousands of Americans flooded westward. The territories that Mexico had ceded were no longer distant, sparsely populated frontiers. They became the foundation of American westward expansion. Historians often speak of the concept of manifest destiny as if it were a pre-existing doctrine that drove American expansion. But manifest destiny became genuinely powerful only after the Mexican-American War proved that territorial acquisition was achievable. Before the war, westward expansion was debated. After the war, it became almost assumed. The Mexican territory provided the physical space, the resources, and the psychological momentum that transformed the United States from a nation confined to the eastern half of the continent into a transcontinental power. The Mexican government that followed Santa Anna's departure attempted to rebuild, but it operated in a fundamentally diminished state. Its revenue base had shrunk. Its northern frontier was now indefensible. The very shape of the nation had changed. future Mexican leaders would face the constant reality of sharing a border with a Ulei neighbor that had just demonstrated its military superiority, its willingness to use force, and its appetite for territory. Within the territories Mexico had ceded, the transformation was immediate and visible. American settlers arrived in waves. Roads that had connected these regions to Mexico City were abandoned in favor of routes leading north toward American population centers. Economic networks that had flowed southward began to flow northward instead. Over the course of a generation, these territories ceased to be Mexican in any meaningful sense. They became American in law, in settlement pattern, in economic orientation, and eventually in culture and language, though Mexican influence would persist in these lands for centuries. The treaty also had a symbolic weight that extended beyond geography. It demonstrated that in the contest between two nations on the North American continent, one could impose its will on the other through military force. It created a precedent. It established a hierarchy of power. And for Mexico, it meant that the nation's future would be shaped not primarily by its own internal choices, but by the proximity and power of its northern neighbor. The 2 years from 1846 to 1848 had done more than transfer territory. They had redrawn the entire power structure of North America. Mexico had entered that period as a nation with acknowledged claims to vast western lands. It exited as a nation confined to the southern and central portions of the continent. The United States had entered as a nation still debating the limits of its expansion. It exited with a clear continental destiny and the territory to pursue it. The consequences of those 2 years would ripple forward through the next century and beyond. Every subsequent conflict between Mexico and the United States would occur in the shadow of this imbalance. Every border dispute, every migration question, every economic negotiation would be conducted between nations whose relative power had been decisively established in 1846 and 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed as a resolution, but it was actually the opening of a new chapter in North American history, one written entirely by the victor. The territories that Mexico had surrendered were not empty lands waiting for American settlement. They were spaces already inhabited, already claimed, already alive with their own histories. In California, where gold would be discovered within months of the treaty's signing, tens of thousands of people would arrive within years. In the Great Basin in the Southwest, in the vast stretches that would become states, all of it would be reorganized under American law, American governance, American settlement patterns. What had been Mexican Alta California became American territory, where the transformation happened at extraordinary speed. Santa Anna watched this from exile. He had signed the treaty knowing it would end his political standing in Mexico. The moment the ink dried, he became a symbol of defeat. Citizens who had supported him began to distance themselves. Those who opposed him used the treaty as proof of his incompetence. He had returned to power to save the nation, and instead presided over its partition. Within months, he was forced to resign again. He left Mexico City. He left the country. He would spend years moving between exile locations, writing justifications that few read, gradually becoming a historical footnote to the very event that had defined him. But Santa Anna's personal exile was minor compared to what happened to Mexico's political landscape. The treaty had been ratified, but barely. The Mexican Congress had approved it by a narrow margin under intense pressure. Delegates knew that rejecting it meant continued American occupation, meant more Mexican soldiers dying, meant even harsher terms being imposed. They voted for it as a choice between bad options, not as a choice they wanted to make. That distinction mattered. It meant the treaty was never going to be accepted as legitimate by the Mexican public. It meant Santa Anna and everyone associated with it would be marked as the men who lost Mexico. The years immediately after 1848 saw Mexico attempt to rebuild, but the nation that emerged was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before. The military had been decimated. The treasury was empty. The government had lost control over vast territories and the resources those territories contained. The loss of California meant the loss of potential mineral wealth, agricultural land, and access to Pacific ports that might have allowed Mexico to develop as a maritime power. The loss of the northern territories meant the loss of buffer land between the Mexican heartland and American expansion. Domestically, Mexico was even more fragmented than before. The war and its catastrophic conclusion had intensified the divide between liberals and conservatives. Liberals blamed conservatives for their resistance to modernization and military reform. Conservatives blamed liberals for revolutionary idealism that had weakened Mexico's institutions. Both groups blamed everyone else for the loss of territory. The government that tried to govern in the years after the treaty was a government without consensus, without resources, and without the ability to present itself as legitimate to its own population. The loss of half the nation's territory meant loss of half its potential tax base. It meant loss of land that could have been developed, settled, and integrated into the Mexican economy. It meant that every future Mexican government would have to function within tighter constraints than those faced by governments before 1846. Mexico would never have the economic capacity that a unified North, American continent might have developed. Instead, it would exist as a nation defined by what had been taken from it. In the United States, the reaction was almost entirely different. Yes, there had been opposition to the war. Northern states that opposed slavery worried about new territories being claimed for slavery's expansion. Whig politicians questioned whether the war had been justified. Some voices argued that Mexico had been treated unjustly, but these voices were marginal. The dominant narrative in American politics was triumph. The nation had proven its military capacity. It had proven that it could project power across vast distances. It had acquired territory that would reshape American development for generations. The California Gold Rush began in 1848, the same year the treaty was signed. Within a year, tens of thousands of Americans were flooding into California seeking wealth. The infrastructure that had been built to support American military occupation suddenly became the foundation for American settlement. Forts became towns. Military supply routes became trade routes. The American government began organizing the new territories almost immediately. California, despite its distance and its large existing Mexican population, was moving towards statehood within a few years. Utah, Nevada, most of Arizona, most of New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, all the territories ceded in the treaty, began to be reorganized. Some of it remained relatively empty, but all of it was now American. All of it was now subject to American laws, American settlement, American development. The frontier that had been the Mexican frontier became the American frontier. The process of opening the American West, which had been a slow, contested, uncertain process before 1846, suddenly became inevitable after 1848. The treaty had included a clause guaranteeing the property rights of Mexican citizens who remained in the ceded territories. But enforcement was weak and inconsistent. Many Mexican landowners found their claims challenged, disputed, and ultimately lost. American settlers arrived with American legal frameworks, American assumptions about land ownership, and American determination to establish American control. Over the following decades, most of the land in the ceded territories that had been held by Mexican families passed into American hands. The human cost was less visible, but equally real. Tens of thousands of Mexicans who had lived in what was now American territory faced a choice. They could remain and become subjects of American rule, or they could migrate south into what remained of Mexico. Some chose to stay. Many chose to leave. Either way, there was discontinuity, displacement, and the severing of connections to land and community that had existed for generations. The border itself became a new reality. Before 1846, The frontier between Mexico and the United States had been contested, ambiguous, and permeable. After 1848, there was a defined border established by the treaty. The United States and Mexico now shared a defined boundary that ran from the Gulf of Mexico westward, then northwest toward the Pacific. That boundary would become one of the most important political and economic lines on the North American continent. For Mexico, it represented everything that had been lost. For the United States, it represented the accomplishment of territorial ambition. But the treaty's consequences extended far beyond territory and economics. It established a precedent for how conflicts between the two nations would be resolved. It demonstrated that military superiority could be translated into territorial acquisition through diplomatic means. It showed that a nation could be forced to surrender vast portions of its sovereignty through a combination of military defeat and diplomatic pressure. That precedent would shape every subsequent interaction between Mexico and the United States. The war itself, though brief by the standards of major conflicts, had been significant in military terms. It had demonstrated American capacity for power projection. It had shown that American military organization, American logistics, and American determination could overcome Mexican numbers and Mexican defense of home territory. American officers who had served in the Mexican War, men like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, William Tecumseh Sherman, had gained experience that would later shape their roles in the American Civil War. The Mexican War was not just a territorial conflict, it was a proving ground for American military capability, and that capability would not be forgotten. The fact that the United States had defeated Mexico decisively meant that Mexico would have to manage its relationship with the United States from a position of permanent disadvantage. Every future negotiation, every future dispute, every future interaction would occur in the shadow of the knowledge that the United States had already proven it could take what it wanted from Mexico militarily. That asymmetry, established in 1846 and 1848, would persist. In Mexico City, the government attempted to stabilize, but the knowledge that half the nation had been lost, that the loss had come through military defeat, that the treaty had been signed under duress and was considered illegitimate by large portions of the population, all of this hung over Mexican politics. Future governments would face the impossible task of governing a nation that felt diminished, that had lost territory, that had been humiliated. Some future Mexican leaders would attempt to recover lost territory. All would fail. The border established in 1848 would persist, essentially unchanged, for more than a century and a half. The 2 years from 1846 to 1848 had accomplished what centuries of gradual expansion had not. They had established the territorial shape of North America for generations to come. Mexico was fixed in place, confined to the southern and central portions of the continent. The United States had achieved the territorial base for continental dominance. The West was open, the boundary was set, the power relationship was established, and it had all happened because of decisions made by specific people in specific moments, because Polk had decided to invade, because Mexican generals had been unable to organize effective resistance, because Santa Anna had decided to negotiate rather than fight to the end, because the Mexican Congress had voted to ratify the treaty rather than reject it, because American military organization had proven superior to Mexican organization in the crucial tests of 1846 and 1847, because American political will to expand had been stronger than Mexican political will to resist. None of it had been inevitable. A different choice at any of those critical moments might have changed everything. A more unified Mexican government might have resisted more effectively. A less aggressive American administration might have pursued different objectives. A better organized Mexican military might have inflicted enough casualties to change American calculations. But those alternatives had not occurred. The actual history, the one where Mexico lost half its territory in 2 years, was the history that had happened. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, was presented as a peace agreement, a diplomatic solution to the conflict that had erupted 2 years earlier. But it was actually something different. It was a territorial revolution dressed in diplomatic language. It was the consequence of military conquest expressed through legal forms. It was the transformation of North American geography, executed through a pen and signatures. It was the opening act of the American continental era. And for Mexico, it was the moment when the nation became permanently aware of what it had lost and what it could never recover.